or PowerPoint that I used to use a long time ago. So animations and all that sort of thing are completely out. I'll have to study to do that. The things I always noticed with people using PowerPoint was that they, first of all, had a tendency to talk to the screen, because you've done the presentation and it's really interesting, it's your presentation, so you talk to the screen. And that's the first thing I want to catch me out on. I do not want to talk to the screen. I might look at the screen, but I don't want to talk to the screen. And secondly, it's about preparation. You know, if you're going to do a PowerPoint preparation, you should spend some time doing it. So when I started this at 3 o'clock this afternoon, I knew that I was into some serious preparation. So in a land where all the films have been on television at least 3 times and the stuff's going around, endless repeats, you at least have the satisfaction of knowing that if it starts in this little presentation, it is the first time it has been seen by anyone, including me. Right. I'll stop. So, what I want you to do is just work with me to consider what is the connection between the following things. And should work, but it doesn't. 18th century lady's corset, or you're not connected. They do it for me. Or the French Revolution and an 18th century lady's corset. That is the quiz. That's the only quiz tonight. Any clues? Anyone want to offer a thought? Well, this is a clue. This is the guy who was the connection between them all. And he's the most famous Englishman you've probably never heard of, Tom Paine. And his contribution to Western society was phenomenal. And you may wonder why and how that happened. Because most people just say who when you say Tom Paine. They say who? Tom Paine? No, not really. This isn't Tom Paine. Here he is, the man of star of stage, screen and television, Sir Richard Attenborough. He said that Tom Paine was perhaps the most influential Englishman who ever lived. He actually made a film about him, which I can see from your expressions nobody's seen except me. So you see, the most...
I have heard the name.
You've heard the name? Well, there we are. He was born in Thetford in Norfolk, little town in 1737, and he's the favourite son of the town. And his family were Quakers, and they made corsets, and that's the connection with the first connection with Tom Paine. And it was an interesting occupation, because in those days, no self-respecting woman would be seen outside the house without a corset. It's just the way it was. And if you made corsets, well, you could make a decent little living out of it, no doubt about it, but it was hard work, particularly working for the aristocracy, because the aristocracy bought a lot of corsets, but tended not to pay their bills. So Tom Paine grew up with a sense of questioning the aristocracy and what they were up to. He went to Thetford Grammar School. Here it is. He sat at one of those little tables and he learned his lessons, and he was a model pupil. Wasn't exceptional, but he was a good boy, and everybody regarded him as something worthwhile. And then in 1757 he ran away to sea and did some merchant adventuring for a couple of years on American ships and on British ships and on French ships. And then 1759 he came back and started making corsets again, and he got a bit fed up with that. So in 1761 he became an exciseman for George III. And it was a dodgy business being an exciseman, because excisemen caught smugglers. And they were also very poorly paid by the king. The king at that stage, George III, was a hugely autocratic person. He had enormous power over the country. It's not like the monarch today, who hopes that, she isn't going to get in the press anytime soon. George III was one of those Hanoverian German monarchs who had absolute power over a lot of things in the country. And all of the revenue that came from the duty that came in on brandy and whiskey and all that sort of thing came to the king personally. And he was very jealous of it. So he appointed excisemen to go and look after it. And Tom Paine, after a few different excursions here and there, ended up in Sussex. And in Sussex, he had to guard this coastline and in particular this area around Beachy Head, what's now Eastbourne, and Seafoot Bay, where there was a lot of smuggling. And it even came up to a little town called Lewes in Sussex, where I used to work, and where I first heard of, but became more aware of Tom Paine. So he had an interesting existence. He worked in Lewes for a while. He created something called the Headstrong Club, and that was the beginning of him as a significant force in the land, if you like. The Headstrong Club debated issues, politics, life, economics, and generally hated the aristocracy and oppression. I don't know whether it stood in politics today. I don't think that it had been in any of the political parties. They'd probably have started their own. But Tom Paine fell out badly, very badly, with George III, because they were poorly paid, and he made the case that if they were better paid, there wouldn't be so much corruption, because there was a lot of corruption in the excise. People would take backhanders from the smugglers, of course they did, and carry it away to their cellars. And he argued, he was a very righteous man in that sense, a Quaker, so he argued with the king, and he prepared this pamphlet that went all the way around the country, arguing the case for the excise men to be paid more. And you can imagine what effect that had on George III. There's George III, looking every bit as imperious and lordly as he truly was. He was a bully, and he wasn't a very nice man. Obviously had his moments. I think he had, his wife Charlotte had 15 children. And he was well known for his tactics of disapproving of people who disapproved of him. So Tom Paine became an arch critic of George III. After George III rubbished his case for the excise men, George III said, if you go on with this anymore, I'll call you a traitor and you'll be hung. It's as simple as that. So the cartoonists picked it up and started to depict this contest between the king and Tom Paine, where the king there is getting a bloody nose because Tom Paine, you can't read the writing. Monty Python didn't invent satire. It's been around a long time, but the satire that they practiced in those days was written in quite long statements of, you had to read it through. And this one says, here is the fearless man who is contesting the guardian of the rights, a boxing match, and the king got a bloody nose, and he wasn't very pleased about that, I can tell you. And so the cartoonists really had a great time with them, because Tom Paine went on, he criticised King George III as a tyrannical oppressor of the people. And if you look back on English history, that's exactly what there was at that time, because the people, they either worked in slave factories or they were in agriculture, and there was a huge gap between the aristocracy and the plentifulness that King George and his cohorts had, and the ordinary people. So this sort of thing appeared in the satirical magazines, you see, of the bloated, overfed king and his equally bloated, overfed wife, who were sort of saying, what's all about all these common people? What are they saying? Who do they think they are? What Tom Paine, get rid of him. That was when George III decided that Tom Paine had to go. And Tom Paine did go. He was sitting in a pub with some friends, and some friends came in and said to him, Tom, the king's after you, you better leave the country. And Tom said, I'm having my dinner, I'll leave the country. And they said, no, Tom, leave your dinner now. And he fled to America, and he became involved in the American War of Independence. And he actually became a citizen of Pennsylvania. So he wrote this famous pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he derided the king, denounced the king as holding on to the colony of America, and said, common sense says that you should be independent. You should have your independence, and America should be its own country and its own state. And it was a tremendously influential thing in the American War of Independence. In fact, there are a lot of people who say that Tom Paine, together with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, inspired the American War of Independence. But for a long time, his name just dropped out. and I'll tell you why later. The Americans for a long time kind of dropped him out of things, which was a shame, because he actually helped Thomas Jefferson write the American Declaration of Independence. And the Americans kind of overlook that these days, but it's true, an Englishman who helped write the American Declaration of Independence. So this got back, of course, to England, and George III was absolutely livid at this. I mean, there, you know, he says that nature ever suffered this reptile, and there's Tom Paine. He's holding Tom Paine in his hand in his new American outfit and vowing to kill him if he ever comes back to the UK. And then Tom Paine did other things when he was in America. Amazingly, he invented this single-span iron bridge. I don't know why, out of all his political thinking, this suddenly came. But he'd always been fond of maths and geometry, and he just invented this. And it was actually built. This was built in Philadelphia across one of the big rivers. So he wasn't just a political agitator. And in fact, in 1787, he went to France to sell his bridge design to the French, partly because of that, and also partly because he'd heard of the French Revolution starting in and it was building up. The whole thing was building up against Louis XVI. The French people, the French people were starving because Louis XVI had given a lot of money to the American War of Independence, which is why the Americans still have this kind of special relationship with the French. Not according to George W. Bush, if you remember, after the Iraq War, where he said the French, he said they haven't even got a word for entrepreneur. He became really involved in the French Revolution, and he knew all of the key players, Robespierre and Marat and all the rest of them. He was right there in the middle of the French Revolution. It's incredible. He actually was elected a député, that's an MP for Calais in France, which Calais had an interesting checkered history. But he became a French MP under the National Convention. Now, if you go up to any Frenchman, and I have done this, and say, did you know that there was once an Englishman who was one of your members of Parliament? They'll say, no, absolutely not. Yeah. But it's true, he did. And he published in 1791 this paper, The Rights of Man, in defense of the French Revolution and the whole idea of democracy. And it got back to George III, of course, who said, democracy? Who needs democracy when they've got a king? And then, back to France, he wrote another wonderful piece of work called The Rights of Man, which was really a sort of humanist statement of the rights of the individual compared to the way in which the aristocracy ruled everyone and kept everyone subjugated. And he became a celebrity in France, of course, as part of the revolution, but he became ever more infamous in England, and George III used to blow his top. They called him in the end Mad King George. He did go mad, and this was probably part of it. He was so outraged that he caused all of the local the newspapers and the magazines to create satire about Tom Paine. Here you have Tom Paine depicted as this reprobate, really, and he's the corset maker trying to squeeze the revolution in France into this depiction of the English heroine who doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And he was just ridiculed in the press as a lunatic. This is him being ridiculed as someone who was measuring himself up to be king. That's how the satire worked in those days. Nothing much changes, does it, I think. The king accused him of being the devil, and he was denounced from the pulpit in many churches. And then he went back to France, but he was disillusioned wholly with the violence of the French Revolution. He tried his hardest to save Louis XVI from being executed, and he couldn't, because he was a humanist and he didn't want anybody killed. And then he fell out with Robespierre. That's a name that always sticks in your mind, isn't it? The French Revolution. Robespierre is one of the key players. And Robespierre had him arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille, where he again wrote something called The Age of Reason, another book, The Age of Reason. This time, he made a mistake. He attacked the monarchy, he attacked the aristocracy, people were okay with that. On this occasion, he attacked what he regarded as corruption in the established churches. people selling indulgences and the riches that had been accumulated in a lot of the churches, and that just generally didn't go down terribly well with people. So there he was. He worked at that while he was in the Bastille, and then he'd had enough. 1802, he returned to America. He was ridiculed for his attacks on religion. They forgot about all the rest. And when I said to him that, for all the work that he'd done, created the American Declaration of Independence, or worked with them, he'd inspired the American Civil War and kept it going at a time when it was failing. And yet when he came back, America, as it is now, is a strongly Protestant nation, he rattled the cage over religion a little bit, and it didn't go down well. And he got all this satire, and here he is reading his tirade against the church. That's how he wasn't actually, he was Quaker all his life, he wasn't actually terribly religious. And then he got this sort of press, where here you have England and the hubbub in England, here you have the little man, the little Frenchman on his little place, and here you have the hubbub in America. Tom Paine as the skeleton sitting on the back of John Bull, the hero, and generally being regarded as the devil. Got a lot of that satire. It's amazing stuff. And then he died destitute in 1809. He died in America, and that's his death mask. I've actually seen it in Thetford. It's a bit scary when you see it close up. That's what they used to do in those days, but he just faded out. His legacy, well, you can love him or hate him. You can love him or hate him. But he's now accepted as a liberator and a free thinker, and these were his ideas. This is what, when I said the age of reason in his work, this is a summation of what he said at the time. His ideas were more tax on inherited wealth, less tax on working people. Outrageous. Outrageous. King went off the wall. State-funded education. Sorry, education. I missed my banana fingers, missed the I. You'll have to forgive that. State-funded education for the poor, so that children who couldn't afford, their parents couldn't pay for them to go to school, would actually be educated. Outrageous. Just unthinkable. Maternity benefits for women. He actually proposed that women having babies, if they were in work, should have paid leave. Incredible. Child allowance for poor families. Benefits for those over 50 not in work, and a state pension at 60. The most outrageous set of statements that aristocracy had ever seen. And
can I buy his crystal ball?
It's incredible, isn't it? But everything that he proposed came out in the welfare state. So that was his achievement. Common sense was the American Revolution that he really helped to inspire. You can see his handwriting in the American Declaration of Independence, and his script is on the back of it. He wrote The Rights of Man, which is still regarded as one of the great humanist treatises of its day. He wrote The Age of Reason, in which he questioned the authority of some of the churches, and that didn't go down terribly well.